a decorated royal guard, standing proud in his scarlet uniform outside Buckingham Palace, suddenly finds himself at the center of a scandal that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. What started as a routine day protecting the crown would spiral into an incident so shocking that it would force a young Prince George to make a decision that left the entire world speechless. This isn't just another royal controversy. This is the untold story of courage, dignity, and a response so unexpected that it redefined what it means to wear the crown in the modern age. When harassment meets royalty, and when a child's wisdom surpasses that of grown adults, you witness something truly extraordinary. The guard thought he was just doing his job. The harassers thought they could get away with anything. Prince George thought differently. What happened next would make headlines across the globe and prove that sometimes the most powerful responses come from the most unexpected sources. Are you ready to discover how one young royal's reaction to injustice created a moment that no one saw coming? This is that story. Sergeant James Mitchell had been a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time, he had never experienced anything quite like what happened on that crisp October morning. The sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace when James took his position at the main gates. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat sat precisely at regulation height, and his rifle was held in the exact position he had practiced thousands of times before. James came from a military family. His father had served in the Queen's Guard before him, and his grandfather had stood watch during World War II. For the Mitchell family, protecting the crown wasn't just a job. It was a sacred duty passed down through generations. James had earned his position through years of exemplary service in the British Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he had distinguished himself under fire. But nothing had prepared him for what he would face that morning outside the palace gates. The morning started like any other. Tourists began gathering early, cameras ready to capture the famous guards in their iconic uniforms. James was used to the attention. Part of his job was being a living symbol of British tradition and military precision. Children would point and whisper, adults would snap photos, and occasionally someone would try to make him laugh or move. It was all part of the routine, and James handled it with professional dignity. Around 10:30, a group of young men approached the gates. James noticed them immediately, not because they looked particularly threatening, but because their behavior was different from the usual tourists. They were loud, boisterous, and seemed to be filming everything with their phones. At first, James thought they might be social media influencers looking for content. The internet age had brought a new type of visitor to the palace, people who saw the guards not as dedicated soldiers, but as props for their online performances. The group leader, a tall young man with bleached hair and expensive clothing, walked right up to the gate where James stood. "Look at this guy," he said loudly to his camera, standing there like a robot. "But he can't even hear us." His followers laughed and encouraged him to get closer. James remained perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, just as his training demanded. What started as typical tourist behavior quickly escalated into something much more sinister. The young man with the camera began making increasingly inappropriate comments about James personally, about his family, and about the military in general. His followers joined in, each trying to outdo the others with more outrageous statements. They were clearly trying to get a reaction, to create viral content by breaking the legendary composure of a Queen's Guard. James had dealt with difficult visitors before, but this felt different. The comments became more personal, more vicious. The group seemed to know details about recent military casualties and made cruel jokes about fallen soldiers. They mocked the traditions that James held sacred and made increasingly aggressive attempts to provoke him. Other tourists began to notice the commotion, some looking uncomfortable, others pulling out their own phones to record what was happening. The harassment continued for nearly 20 minutes. James's training kicked in completely. He remained motionless, professional, and silent. But inside his mind, he was fighting a battle between his duty to remain composed and his natural human response to defend his honor and the honor of his fallen comrades. The group's leader grew frustrated that he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted and decided to escalate further. "Maybe he's deaf," the young man said, stepping even closer to James's face. "Or maybe he's just scared. Probably never seen real combat anyway." The comment hit particularly hard because James had lost close friends during his service overseas. The group began making increasingly personal attacks, and some bystanders started to look genuinely concerned about what they were witnessing. Just as the situation seemed like it might spiral completely out of control, a black car pulled up to the palace gates. The harassment group was too focused on their cruel entertainment to notice the arrival, but James caught sight of the vehicle from the corner of his eye. It was one of the royal family's cars, returning for what appeared to be a private outing. Security personnel emerged first, quickly assessing the situation at the gates. The car door opened, and to James's surprise, Prince George stepped out alongside his protection officer. The young prince was dressed casually, having just returned from what looked like a sporting activity. At just 10 years old, Prince George was already showing signs of the poise and awareness that came with his royal education. He noticed the commotion immediately and asked his protection officer what was happening. The harassment group was so focused on tormenting James that they initially didn't realize they were now in the presence of actual royalty. Prince George, however, had a clear view of what was taking place. He watched as the group continued their cruel performance, filming themselves as they mocked and belittled the guard who stood protecting his family's home. The young prince's expression grew serious as he observed the situation unfold. What happened next would surprise everyone present, from the tourists to the security personnel to James himself. Prince George didn't retreat into the safety of the palace. He didn't have his protection officers handle the situation. Instead, the 10-year-old prince made a decision that would demonstrate wisdom far beyond his years and courage that would leave witnesses speechless. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. A decorated war veteran standing silently at his post, a group of bullies seeking internet fame through cruelty, and a young prince who was about to prove that true nobility isn't about titles or crowns. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter who you are or how old you might be. As the harassment continued and Prince George stepped forward, everyone present was about to witness something extraordinary. The next few minutes would become the stuff of legend, shared across social media, not as cruel entertainment, but as an example of dignity, courage, and the power of doing what's right when it matters most. The young prince was about to teach everyone present a lesson about respect, honor, and the true meaning of royal responsibility. Prince George stood quietly for a moment, taking in the full scope of what was happening before him. The harassment group was now completely absorbed in their performance, their voices growing louder and more aggressive as they competed for the most outrageous comments. They were so focused on their phones and their cruel entertainment that they remained oblivious to the royal presence just meters away. The young prince turned to his protection officer, a seasoned professional named Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who had been with the royal family for nearly 8 years. "Why are they being so mean to him?" Prince George asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. Inspector Collins explained that some people unfortunately tried to provoke the guards to get reactions for social media, but that the guard were trained to handle such situations professionally. Prince George listened carefully to the explanation, but his young face showed that he wasn't satisfied with simply accepting this as normal behavior. "But he's protecting us," the prince said, looking back at Sergeant Mitchell, who continued to stand at perfect attention despite the ongoing abuse. "Those men are being bullies, and he can't defend himself because of his job. That's not fair." The wisdom in those simple words struck Inspector Collins immediately. Here was a 10-year-old boy who instinctively understood concepts of duty, fairness, and protection that many adults failed to grasp. The young prince wasn't just observing a situation, he was analyzing it from a perspective of justice and responsibility that was remarkable for someone his age. Inspector Collins was trained to protect the royal family, which typically meant removing them from potentially uncomfortable situations as quickly as possible. Her instinct was to escort Prince George into the palace immediately, away from the growing commotion. But something in the young prince's demeanor suggested he had no intention of simply walking away. This wasn't idle curiosity about palace security. This was a young person witnessing injustice and feeling compelled to act. "We should go inside, Your Royal Highness," Inspector Collins said gently. "The situation will be handled appropriately by palace security." But Prince George stood his ground, watching as the harassment group's behavior became increasingly aggressive. One of them had now stepped so close to Sergeant Mitchell that he was practically shouting directly in the guard's face. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Most looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but no one seemed willing to intervene. Some continued filming, though their expressions suggested they were documenting something disturbing rather than entertaining. A few families with young children had moved away from the scene entirely, parents clearly not wanting their children to witness such behavior. Prince George observed all of this with the careful attention that had been instilled in him through his royal education. From an early age, he had been taught to be aware of his surroundings, to understand the impact of his actions, and to consider the welfare of others. His tutors had emphasized that being royal meant being responsible to the people, not just ruling over them. Now, faced with a real-world situation, these lessons took on immediate practical meaning. The harassment leader, still unaware that he was performing his cruelty in front of royalty, decided to escalate even further. He began making jokes about military families and the sacrifices made by service members. His followers encouraged him, laughing at comments that grew increasingly vicious. Some tourists began to look genuinely upset, and a few started to speak up, telling the group that they had gone too far. "Mind your own business," the harassment leader snapped at a tourist who had criticized his behavior. "This is just for fun. The tin soldier here doesn't care. Look at him, he's not even human." The cruel comment was met with uncomfortable silence from most bystanders, but it hit Prince George like a physical blow. To hear someone dismiss a brave soldier as not even human, while that soldier was duty-bound to remain silent, was more than the young prince could tolerate. Sergeant Mitchell, meanwhile, was fighting the hardest battle of his military career. Every instinct screamed at him to respond, to defend himself, and his fallen comrades were being mocked by these cruel strangers. His jaw was clenched so tightly it ached, and his hands gripped his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. But his training held firm. He remained perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, even as tears of frustration and anger threatened to break his professional composure. James thought about his father, who had told him stories of standing guard during much more dangerous times, when the threat was real bombs and bullets rather than cruel words and cameras. He thought about his friends who hadn't come home from Afghanistan, brave soldiers who deserved better than to be mocked by strangers seeking internet fame. Most of all, he thought about his duty, not just to the crown, but to every guard who had stood this post before him and everyone who would stand it after. Prince George had seen enough. Despite Inspector Collins's attempts to guide him toward the palace entrance, the young prince stepped forward, moving closer to the confrontation. His movement was noticed first by some of the tourists, who began to whisper and point. The combination of his unmistakable features and his approach to the scene made it clear to knowledgeable observers that this was no ordinary child. Inspector Collins realized that the situation was about to change dramatically. Her primary responsibility was Prince George's safety, but she also understood that the young prince had made a decision. Her training had prepared her for many scenarios, but a royal intervention in a harassment situation by a 10-year-old was not something covered in any manual. She positioned herself to move quickly if needed while allowing Prince George to proceed. The harassment group was so absorbed in their performance that they still hadn't noticed the royal presence. Their leader was now attempting to touch Sergeant Mitchell's uniform while filming himself doing it, a violation that crossed several lines simultaneously. Palace security was moving into position to intervene, but they too were caught off guard by Prince George's approach to the situation. As Prince George stepped closer, more tourists began to recognize him. Cell phones that had been recording the harassment were now turning toward the approaching prince. The atmosphere began to shift as people realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. A murmur went through the crowd as recognition spread. The young prince was now just a few steps away from the harassment group, close enough that his voice would carry clearly when he chose to speak. Inspector Collins stayed close, ready to act if the situation became dangerous. Palace security moved into better positions, though they too were uncertain about how to handle a situation where a member of the royal family was choosing to directly engage with hostile individuals. Sergeant Mitchell, still maintaining his professional stance, noticed the movement in his peripheral vision. Through years of training and experience, he could sense when situations were about to change, and something in the atmosphere told him that the dynamic was shifting. The harassment group, however, remained completely focused on their cruel entertainment, unaware that they were about to face consequences they never could have imagined. Prince George took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders in a gesture that mirrored the military bearing of the guard being harassed, and prepared to speak. What came next would surprise everyone present and create a moment that would be remembered for years to come. The 10-year-old prince was about to deliver a lesson in dignity, respect, and royal responsibility that would leave witnesses speechless and change how everyone present understood true nobility. "Excuse me," Prince George said in a clear, confident voice that carried across the courtyard. The simple words had an immediate and dramatic effect. The harassment group stopped mid-sentence, turning to see who had interrupted their performance. When they saw a young boy approaching them, their first reaction was annoyance rather than recognition. "Get lost, kid," the group leader said dismissively, not bothering to lower his phone. "We're busy here." But as he looked more closely at the approaching child, something about the boy's bearing, his clothing, and the way security personnel were positioned around him began to register. Several tourists gasped audibly as they realized what was happening. "I said excuse me," Prince George repeated, this time with an unmistakable note of authority that seemed impossible coming from someone so young. "I need to speak with you about how you're treating this soldier." The word soldier was emphasized with a respect that made it clear this wasn't just casual conversation. The harassment leader's phone slowly lowered as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. Around the courtyard, tourists were pulling out their own phones, but now they were recording something entirely different than the cruel entertainment they had been witnessing moments before. The murmur of recognition grew louder as more people realized they were watching a member of the royal family directly confront the harassers. "Do you know who this man is?" Prince George asked, gesturing towards Sergeant Mitchell, who continued to stand at perfect attention. "His name is Sergeant James Mitchell, and he's a decorated war veteran who has served our country with honor. He's protected people like you so that you can stand here safely and say whatever you want." The harassment group exchanged uncertain glances. Their leader tried to maintain his aggressive posture, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "Look, kid, we're just having some fun. No harm done." But Prince George wasn't finished, and his response demonstrated a maturity that left everyone present stunned. "Fun?" Prince George asked, his young voice carrying a tone of disbelief. "You think it's fun to mock someone who can't respond because he's doing his job? You think it's entertaining to make jokes about soldiers who died protecting the freedom you're using to be cruel?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and the harassment group found themselves unable to respond. Sergeant Mitchell, despite his training to remain motionless, felt something shift inside him. For the first time since the harassment began, he wasn't fighting tears of frustration and anger. Instead, he felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. This young prince, who could have simply walked into his palace and ignored the situation, had chosen to stand up for him in a way that was both brave and incredibly moving. Inspector Collins watched in amazement as Prince George continued. "This soldier has stood guard in dangerous places where people were trying to hurt him for real, not just with words. He's protected people he's never met because he believes in serving something bigger than himself. And you think it's appropriate to mock him while he's protecting my family's home?" The crowd of tourists had grown silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cell phone cameras captured every word as Prince George demonstrated a level of wisdom and courage that many adults would struggle to match. The harassment group's followers began to step back, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation had taken. "You don't understand," the harassment leader tried to explain, his voice now lacking its earlier confidence. "We're just making content for our followers. It's not personal." But Prince George's response showed just how deeply he understood the situation. "Not personal?" the young prince asked. "You made jokes about dead soldiers. You called them inhuman. You tried to humiliate someone who has dedicated his life to serving others. How is that not personal?" The questions were delivered with a calm intensity that made them even more powerful. Prince George turned slightly to address the crowd that had gathered. "This man and thousands like him stand watch every day to keep us safe. They sacrifice time with their families, they risk their lives in foreign countries, and they maintain their dignity even when people try to take it away from them. They deserve our respect, not our mockery." The young prince's words began to have a visible effect on the crowd. Several tourists started clapping, slowly at first, then more enthusiastically. The applause grew as more people joined in, creating a sound that echoed across the palace courtyard. The harassment group found themselves surrounded by disapproving faces and a growing demonstration of support for the guard they had been tormenting. "I want you to think about something," Prince George continued, his voice remaining calm and measured despite the emotional weight of his words. "Sergeant Mitchell could probably defend himself physically if he wanted to. He's been trained as a soldier, and I'm sure he's much stronger than any of you. But he chooses not to because he respects his duty more than he values his personal pride. That's what real strength looks like." The harassment leader's phone had long since been lowered, and his followers were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Several tourists were now openly expressing their disgust at what they had witnessed, and some were calling for security to remove the group entirely. The dynamic had completely shifted from the cruel entertainment they had been providing to a moment of education and dignity. Prince George wasn't finished. "My family has taught me that being royal means serving the people, not ruling over them. This soldier serves in the same way. He stands here not because he has to, but because he chooses to dedicate his life to protecting others. When you mock him, you mock everyone who has ever chosen service over selfishness." Sergeant Mitchell felt tears welling up in his eyes, but for the first time since the harassment began, they weren't tears of frustration. They were tears of pride and gratitude. This young prince had not only defended him, but had articulated the very principles that had guided his military service better than he could have done himself. The harassment group was now completely deflated. Their leader made one final attempt to justify their behavior. "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just trying to get a reaction." But Prince George's response demonstrated a level of moral clarity that was devastating in its simplicity. "The fact that you're trying to hurt someone just to entertain yourselves makes it worse, not better," Prince George said. "If you had a good reason, that would be different. But you chose to be cruel just because you could and because you thought he couldn't stop you. That's not just wrong, it's cowardly." The word cowardly hit the harassment group like a physical blow. To be called cowards by a 10-year-old, in front of a crowd of witnesses and countless cell phone cameras, was more humiliating than anything they could have imagined. Their attempt to create viral content had backfired spectacularly, turning them from entertainers into examples of everything that was wrong with internet culture. Palace security was now positioned to remove the harassment group if Prince George requested it, but the young prince had one more thing to say. His final words would complete his remarkable intervention and leave everyone present with a memory they would never forget. The lesson was almost complete, but the most powerful moment was yet to come. Prince George looked directly at the harassment leader, and what he said next would become one of the most quoted royal statements of the modern era. "I want you to apologize to Sergeant Mitchell," the young prince said with quiet authority. "Not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do. And I want you to understand why you're apologizing. The harassment leader opened his mouth to object, but Prince George continued before he could speak. You're not apologizing because you got caught. You're not apologizing because people are watching. You're apologizing because you chose to be cruel to someone who has dedicated his life to serving others. And that choice says something about who you are as a person. The silence that followed was profound. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. The harassment leader looked around at the faces surrounding him. Tourists who had gone from uncomfortable witnesses to active supporters of the young prince's intervention, security personnel who were clearly ready to act if needed, and fellow group members who were obviously wishing they were anywhere else. Look, the leader said weakly. We didn't know he was a war veteran or anything. We just thought he was, just a guard. But Prince George's response demonstrated that he understood the deeper issue at stake. Just a guard? Prince George repeated. Do you think someone's value as a human being depends on their job title? Do you think it's acceptable to mock and humiliate people as long as they're just anything? The young prince's questions exposed the fundamental cruelty of the harassment group's mindset in a way that left no room for justification. Inspector Collins watched in continued amazement as Prince George handled the situation with more skill than many trained diplomats. The young prince wasn't just defending Sergeant Mitchell. He was delivering a masterclass in leadership, dignity, and moral courage that would be studied and admired for years to come. One of the harassment group's followers stepped forward. We're sorry, he said, addressing Sergeant Mitchell directly. What we did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. His apology seemed genuine, and it clearly surprised his companions. The young man continued, You didn't deserve that treatment, and we should have known better. Prince George nodded approvingly at the apology, then turned his attention back to the group leader who was still hesitating. What about you? The young prince asked. Are you going to take responsibility for your actions, or are you going to let your friend be the only one with enough character to do the right thing? The pressure was becoming unbearable for the harassment leader. Surrounded by disapproving faces, captured on dozens of cell phone cameras, and confronted by a 10-year-old who had systematically dismantled every justification he might offer, he finally cracked. Fine, he said reluctantly. I'm sorry we bothered you, okay? But Prince George wasn't satisfied with a grudging, minimal apology. That's not good enough, he said firmly. You're not sorry you bothered him. You're sorry you got called out for it. A real apology acknowledges what you did wrong and shows that you understand why it was wrong. The young prince's insistence on a meaningful apology rather than just words demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of accountability and genuine remorse. Around the courtyard, tourists continued to applaud and express their admiration for the way Prince George was handling the situation. Sergeant Mitchell remained at perfect attention throughout the entire confrontation, but those close enough could see the emotion in his eyes. The young prince's defense of him was more powerful than anything he could have said in his own defense. To have a member of the royal family, a child no less, stand up for his honor and dignity was overwhelming. Finally, under the continued pressure of Prince George's moral authority and the disapproval of the crowd, the harassment leader managed a more appropriate apology. Sergeant Mitchell, he said, looking directly at the guard for the first time, I apologize for the things we said. You were doing your job, and we had no right to treat you that way. What we did was cruel and unnecessary. Prince George nodded, satisfied that a genuine apology had finally been offered. But he wasn't finished with his intervention. Now I want you to think about something, he told the harassment group. You came here today planning to be cruel to someone for entertainment. But instead, you've learned something about respect, about service, and about taking responsibility for your actions. The young prince's ability to turn the confrontation into a teaching moment demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years. You have a choice now, he continued. You can go home and forget about this, or you can remember this moment and choose to be better people. You can use your phones and your followers to build people up instead of tearing them down. Inspector Collins realized that Prince George was doing more than just defending a guard. He was attempting to actually change the harasser's perspective and behavior. This wasn't just about stopping bad behavior. It was about inspiring better behavior. The approach was both sophisticated and genuinely hopeful. Several tourists began expressing their admiration for Prince George's handling of the situation. "That young man is going to be an incredible king someday," one elderly woman said to her husband. "Look how he stands up for people who can't defend themselves." Others echoed similar sentiments, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly special. The harassment group was preparing to leave, clearly eager to escape the continued scrutiny and disapproval. But Prince George had one final interaction that would complete his remarkable intervention. He turned to Sergeant Mitchell, who had maintained his professional posture throughout the entire confrontation. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince George said formally, "I want you to know that my family and I are grateful for your service. You represent the very best of what it means to serve others, and your dignity in the face of cruelty has been an example to everyone here today." For the first time since taking his post that morning, Sergeant Mitchell was permitted to respond. Following proper protocol for addressing a member of the royal family, he said, "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It has been my honor to serve." The exchange was brief but profoundly moving. The guard who had been mocked and belittled was now being publicly honored by a prince. The tourists who had witnessed the transformation applauded again, this time even more enthusiastically than before. As the harassment group finally departed, looking thoroughly chastened by their encounter with royal moral authority, Prince George turned to address the crowd of tourists who had gathered. His final words to them would complete one of the most remarkable displays of leadership and character ever witnessed outside Buckingham Palace. The 10-year-old prince was about to deliver a message that would resonate far beyond the palace gates, shared across social media not as cruel entertainment, but as an inspiring example of what true nobility really means. The lesson was almost complete, but the most powerful moment was still to come. Prince George turned to face the assembled crowd of tourists, many of whom were still recording with their phones. Instead of being intimidated by the cameras or rushing to escape the attention, the young prince recognized an opportunity to share an important message with people from around the world. "I know many of you have been filming what happened here," Prince George said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I hope when you share these videos, you'll remember that this isn't about me or my family. This is about treating people with dignity and respect, especially those who serve others." The crowd listened in respectful silence as the 10-year-old prince continued his remarkable address. Every day, people like Sergeant Mitchell choose to put service before self-interest. Soldiers, police officers, firefighters, teachers, doctors, and so many others dedicate their lives to making the world better and safer for the rest of us. They deserve our gratitude, not our mockery. An elderly veteran in the crowd stepped forward and saluted Prince George. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," he said with obvious emotion. "You've honored all of us who have served today." The gesture was spontaneous and deeply moving, representing the feelings of many present who had watched the young prince defend the principles they held dear. Prince George returned the veteran's salute with the proper respect, demonstrating that his royal education had included appropriate military courtesies. "Thank you for your service," he replied formally. "People like you and Sergeant Mitchell make it possible for the rest of us to live freely and safely." Inspector Collins observed the interaction with professional admiration and personal pride. In her years of protecting the royal family, she had never seen anything quite like what Prince George had accomplished. The young prince had not only handled a difficult situation with remarkable skill, but had turned it into a teaching moment that would inspire people around the world. As news of the confrontation began to spread through social media, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Videos of Prince George defending Sergeant Mitchell were shared thousands of times within the first hour, each share accompanied by comments expressing admiration for the young prince's courage and wisdom. The story quickly caught the attention of news organizations around the world. 10-year-old prince defends royal guard became the headline that dominated news cycles for days. Television networks played the footage repeatedly, with commentators praising Prince George's maturity and moral courage. Military organizations and veterans groups were particularly vocal in their appreciation. The British Legion issued a statement thanking Prince George for his defense of military personnel and his eloquent expression of the values that service members hold dear. Similar organizations around the world echoed these sentiments, recognizing that the young prince had articulated something important about the relationship between civilians and those who serve in uniform. Back at the palace, Sergeant Mitchell completed his shift with a profound sense of pride and gratitude. The harassment that had threatened to ruin his day had instead become part of an experience he would treasure forever. When his relief arrived, fellow guards who had heard about the incident gathered around to hear the full story. The young prince didn't have to do anything, Sergeant Mitchell told his colleagues. He could have just gone inside and let security handle it. But he chose to stand up for what was right, and he did it better than most adults could have managed. The story of Prince George's intervention spread far beyond the initial social media posts and news reports. It became a teaching tool in schools, where educators used it to discuss topics ranging from bullying prevention to civic responsibility. The young prince's words about service and dignity were quoted in military training programs and leadership courses. Perhaps most importantly, the incident seemed to inspire others to speak up when they witnessed similar situations. Reports began emerging from around the world of people defending service members, veterans, and others who were being harassed or mistreated. Prince George's example had created a ripple effect of positive action. The harassment group that had started the entire incident found themselves facing very different consequences than they had anticipated. Instead of gaining followers and internet fame through cruelty, their behavior had been exposed as cowardly and inappropriate. Several lost jobs or educational opportunities as their actions became widely known. However, true to Prince George's hopeful message, some members of the group did seem to genuinely learn from the experience. The follower who had first apologized to Sergeant Mitchell later posted his own video, taking full responsibility for his actions and encouraging others to treat service members with respect. His genuine remorse and commitment to do better became another positive element in a story that could have ended much differently. Prince George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, were reportedly both proud and moved by their son's actions. Palace sources indicated that the young prince had acted entirely on his own initiative, applying lessons about service and responsibility that had been part of his education, but had never been tested in such a real-world situation. The incident also highlighted important questions about social media culture and the responsibility that comes with having an online platform. Prince George's intervention had shown that viral content could be uplifting and educational rather than cruel and exploitative. Many content creators began to examine their own practices in light of the example set by the 10-year-old prince. For Sergeant Mitchell, the day that had started with cruel harassment ended with global recognition for his service and dignity. He received thousands of messages of support from around the world, from fellow veterans, active service members, and civilians who had been moved by Prince George's defense of him. In interviews given weeks later, Sergeant Mitchell consistently emphasized that the real hero of the story was Prince George. That young man showed more courage and wisdom in 10 minutes than most people display in a lifetime, he said. He could have ignored the situation, but he chose to do what was right. That's what real leadership looks like. The story became a defining moment, not just for Prince George personally, but for the modern royal family's approach to public service and moral leadership. It demonstrated that being royal wasn't about privilege and distance from ordinary people, but about using position and influence to defend what's right and support those who serve others. As the months passed, the incident continued to be remembered and referenced as an example of how young people could make a difference in the world. Prince George had shown that age was no barrier to moral courage, and that sometimes the most powerful interventions came from the most unexpected sources. The Royal Guard harassment incident became more than just a news story. It became a lesson in dignity, respect, and the power of standing up for others. And it all started with a 10-year-old prince who chose to do what was right when it mattered most, leaving everyone speechless with his wisdom and courage. Years later, when people remember this story, they don't focus on the cruelty that started it. Instead, they remember the moment when a young prince showed the world what true nobility really means, and how one person's courage can inspire positive change that spreads far beyond anything they could have imagined.